The Falcons could make a big splash at wide receiver in free agency, but more likely they'll just probably dip their toe in.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy. And of course, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons. And on today's episode, we're going to do our in-depth breakdown of the free agent wide receivers. Wide receivers being a massive need for the Falcons. We'll look at some of the guys at the top of the market that the Falcons probably won't get, as well as some guys that maybe the mid-tier free agents that is probably a likelier shot that the Falcons wind up targeting some of those guys. But, before we get into this, we don't know what's going to happen, right? These next couple of days, as we go through like the impending free agents and how the market stacks up, we're going to be doing our best here on Locked On Falcons to kind of make educated guesses, but we're going to emphasize the guess part of it, right? And that's what's so fascinating about next week when the legal tampering period begins on Monday, and then officially free agency kicks off on Wednesday. We don't really know what's going to happen, and it makes it a little exciting. It's like, I won't compare it to being a kid on Christmas because I don't know if you're going to be unwrapping gifts. And when you do unwrap gifts, is it going to be socks, right? As opposed to the flashy toy that, all your friends at school are talking about, the video games, the action figures, all that stuff that, most of us as children coveted on Christmas. I don't know if we're going to be in that boat, but it is going to be fascinating to sort of see how this new regime under Kevin Stefanski and general manager Ian Cunningham sort of attacked this thing. As I've been hinting at and outright saying on a number of episodes, including yesterday's episode, or not yesterday's, but whenever we did the salary cap breakdown. Was that yesterday? I don't know. They all blur together, guys. But, I'm not expecting the Falcons to go on this free agent spending spree, right? I kind of think they're going to kind of take it easy. But let's break down this wide receiver group, and we are going to do similar to what we talked about with the quarterbacks in 3 separate buckets. We're going to have the top of the market, we're going to have the mid-tier guys, we're going to have the low-tier guys, right? And the top of the market we'll break down first. Those are going to be the guys that are likely to get wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 type money. 2 years ago, the Falcons gave Darnell Mooney wide receiver 2 money, which was $13 million per year. That would project to be about $15 million in today's salary cap dollars. And I think there are about 8 free agents slated to be free agents at this point in time that are expected to be at the top of the market. Mike Evans, Alec Pierce, Wan'Dale Robinson, Jawan Jennings, Jalen Naylor, Romeo Dobbs, Rashid Shaheed, and Deebo Samuel are, to me, the top of the market guys. And we can discuss a little bit of sort of my best guess, again, emphasis on guess when it comes to what their contract projections are, and looking at websites like PFF as well as The Athletic and their contract projections sort of do that. Now, Pierce isn't expected to leave Indy. As of Tuesday, he has not been officially franchise tagged. They put a transition tag on Daniel Jones. And the expectation is that the Colts will put a full court blitz between now and Sunday to get Alec Pierce signed to a deal that is likely, to me, going to be north of the $23 million a year deal that they gave to Michael Pittman Jr. a couple of years ago. And I think that number could be, in that $25 million year range. Mike Evans is either going to stay in Tampa Bay or go to a contender. And unfortunately, the Falcons are not technically qualifying as a contender at this point in time. So you can pretty much scratch those guys off the list. And so if the Falcons do go and are willing to pay for wide receiver 2 money, I think guys like Robinson and Shaheed and Jennings and Samuel and Naylor potentially are going to be in the range. And all those guys I could see getting, contracts in the 12 to $15 million a year range, potentially 18 to $20 million a year range. Right, we saw Cooper Kupp last year signed for $15 million as the number 2 in Seattle. Jacksonville just paid Jacoby Myers $20 million after trading for him, and I don't think many people consider Jacoby Myers to be the number 1 wide receiver there. He signed a 3 years ago. He signed an $11 million a year contract with the Raiders, which again is approaching $15 million a year in today's money, right? And so, I think if we're playing the fantasy, right, and I emphasize fantasy of like who I would want if the Falcons were indeed shopping in this range, Rashid Shaheed would be my pick. And, I have him projected at like a 3-year, $42 million deal. So about $14 million a year. He's going to give you that explosive vertical threat to sort of complement Drake London. We saw that combination work extremely well for the Falcons in 2024 when Darnell Mooney filled that role. Another player that I think is not being widely considered to be in this tier is Jalen Naylor of the Vikings. He's kind of the lesser version of Rashid Shaheed in terms of that speed threat. Obviously been stuck behind 2 of the best wide receivers in the league these past 2 seasons in Minnesota. But I think a lot of people are going to expect a breakout from him. And I think he's the type. I've seen, various projections that are like, oh, he'll be a low end free agent. And I've been like, he's the exact type of player that is that sort of unproven sort of, B tier player or C tier player that gets to free agency and someone is like, oh, well, we didn't get Rashid Shaheed. And so we didn't get our speed threat. So we're going to go and we're going to pivot to Jalen Naylor and we're going to pay him, $12 million or something like that a year or something along those lines. And so, I think those guys are interesting options in terms of building a room that complements Drake London's skill set quite a bit in terms of guys that are outside threats that add some speed. Wan'Dale Robinson is more of that slot threat that adds some speed to your offense. Deebo Samuel is an interesting option as well, not necessarily adding the speed to your offense, but we've talked before about either wanting a vertical threat opposite Drake London, which would be ideal, but also a guy that could be a yak monster, right? And that's kind of what Deebo Samuel is right now. The concern with Deebo is that he may just kind of be an overpaid gadget guy at this point in time. And I'm kind of expecting him to kind of sign a 1-year prove-it deal because there's been declining production these last couple of years, right? And so it's like the idea of Deebo is a lot more intriguing potentially than the reality of Deebo. But as we've kind of discussed on some of the recent mock draft episodes where we've looked at guys and talked about guys like Zachariah Branch out of Georgia, do you need to pay a premium for a gadget guy like Deebo Samuel is at this point in time, right? A premium gadget guy, but do you need a premium for a gadget guy where, again, you're paying potentially $12 million or more per year, and he's going to be 30 years old when you can get a middle round pick that you may only have to pay like $5 to $7 million over the life of their rookie contract, let alone in 1 year, that being half the number that you have to pay Deebo Samuel for 1 year of production. So again, I don't expect the Falcons to shop in this tier of free agents. I think, a lot of these guys would certainly be intriguing in Atlanta, but we'll break down exactly why I think the Falcons will go cheaper at this position as we get into some of those mid-tier guys as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. March is a time to celebrate women, especially around International Women's Day this Sunday, and to recognize just how much they carry at work and relationships and family and in all the unforeseen roles they step into every single day. It's easy to celebrate that strength, but it's just as important to make space for their emotional well-being. And honestly, that goes for all of us, right? I think about my mom and all that she had to carry raising 3 sons as well. And it makes me think, how many of us are doing the same thing in terms of how much we're carrying and the roles we play and the expectations that we're dealing with and the pressure that we always don't talk about. And therapy can help with all of that, creating balance, setting healthy boundaries, and supporting overall well-being. With over 30,000 licensed therapists and more than 6 million people served worldwide, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform. and it works. Fill out a short questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and if it's not the right fit, you can switch at any time. Your emotional well-being matters. Find support and feel lighter in therapy. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's betterhelp.com/lockedon. So we're talking about free agency, and it's right around the corner. And of course, we want to support you, the everydayer. And you can get 1 month free of the Everydayer Club with code free agency, no spaces, now through March 15th, as well as if you sign up for the Everydayer Club, you get a ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, and you can keep the free agent and off-season conversation going all year long in the Locked On Podcast Network Discord. Head to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more. So, we're going to get into the mid-tier free agents. These are going to be guys that I expect to kind of sign in that $4 to $10 million a year range, right? That's not cheap, right? It's a lot of money, relatively to most people in the NFL. It's kind of just throwaway money. And it's kind of the price of doing business. And that applies pretty much across position groups, right? That mid-tier is basically like $4 to $10 million. That's starter money, but not necessarily like this is changing the fortunes of our franchise type starter money. But, I'm expecting the Falcons to shop in this range because, as we've discussed many times on this podcast now over the last 2 months, the expectation is that the Falcons are going to pay Drake London a lot of money in the next calendar year. Now, when that is that a month from? Is that a week from now? Is that a month from now? Is that a year from now? Is that 6 months from now? Whatever. We don't know. But, I don't think it's really a matter of debate whether or not the Falcons are going to pay Drake London. I know to others there is. Again, we're not going to get into that on today's episode. And I think when you think about Drake London becoming one of the highest paid wide receivers in the NFL, you kind of want to offset those costs with some cheap labor. And that's going to push you towards the draft. And as we discussed on a recent mock draft Monday, there's a world where I think the Falcons double and possibly even triple dip at wide receiver in the draft. I think they'll carry that same strategy into March as well as April, going into free agency, where it's just like, let's just get some competent wide receivers in the room to raise the floor for that room rather than putting it all on some rookies where, that could be a relatively low floor sort of bet. And so let's get some cheap labor in that room and we'll wait and see how we figure out the quarterback. Like, to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense to spend all this money at wide receiver. Go with 2 top of market deals with Drake London and a free agent when you don't really have the quarterback situation figured out at this point in time. Now, maybe 6 months from now, you feel a lot better about this quarterback situation. 9 months from now, obviously, we're hoping to see that happen, et cetera. And then next year, when you have a lot more cash, you can be a little bit more aggressive spending that cash next year if you need to invest at the wide receiver position when you're going to be in a much healthier cap situation going into 2027 than you are in 2026. So, these mid-tier guys, a lot of these guys could wind up signing and settling for 1-year prove-it deals. Some of these guys are older free agents that are unlikely to get the sort of long-term guarantees that you would get on a multi-year contract and will be forced. It's not prove-it deals. It's just kind of like, this is the best offer you're going to get. And then you're going to be back in the market next year, maybe a better market, whatever. A lot of these guys have question marks, whether that's injury concerns, age, lack of production, lack of consistency and whatnot. And so, like, to me, Tyreek Hill is the most notable name in that mid-tier group, right? Obviously, he's here because he's coming off a major knee injury, dislocated knee, tore multiple ligaments in that knee, and that's going to really create some challenges for him moving forward and potentially could, end his career at the next level. And I'm projecting him to potentially, if he does sign with the team, like a 1-year, $5 million deal. He's at the age at 32, which is the age where like 90% of wide receivers fall off a cliff anyway, even if he wasn't coming off an injury. It's, again, a significant injury that, has a fluctuating timetable for return. He suffered it in week 4, I believe. So into September, beginning of October, but it's like a 9 to 12 month recovery. It could be longer than that. And then, of course, you have all the other baggage that comes along with Tyreek Hill, right? He's a big personality. is probably the kindest way you could say it, right? And like if you're a team that just wants your wide receivers to be seen and not heard, like Tyreek Hill is not going to necessarily vibe in that regard. But I think the idea again of Tyreek Hill is intriguing to a lot of folks, especially given his speed. Even if it's diminished, he's still going to be faster than probably 80% of the wide receivers in the NFL. And you couple that with a big arm like Michael Penix or whoever else you think is going to be the Falcons quarterback, it would make sense. But like again, because Hill might miss all, if not most of the offseason, much of training camp and parts of the season, it doesn't really make a ton of sense if you're like, oh, well, we'll get him for Michael Penix, because it's like, when are they going to start practicing together? Like September? And it's like, by that point, can you really build a rapport? We saw that be a major issue for Michael Penix last year with Darnell Mooney missing time during training camp. And so, signing injured players, I think, is going to be a challenge for the Falcons. Now, another guy in this tier is Calvin Austin. He's an undersized slot guy. He might, I've seen some projections that have him making like $11 million a year. I'm not expecting that number. I'm thinking that it's going to be closer to like $8 million a year. But, he's a slot guy. But the funny thing about Calvin Austin is he hasn't been that productive in the slot. He does have some vertical potential. He's been productive in that regard somewhat these last couple of years. But like, to me, Austin is really more of a wide receiver 3 at this point than, someone who's going to spend the wide receiver 2 money on him. Speaking of deep threats, Tyquan Thornton is in this group. He's just purely a deep threat at this point in time. That's a useful skill set, especially given how young he is. I think he's going to be 26 this season. And you compare that to some of the other options when it comes to just, we want to get a deep threat, like Marquez Valdes-Scantling has had that kind of role for like the last 5 years in the NFL, and he's going to be like 32, I think, at this point in time. So Tyquan Thornton, as MVS ages out of that role, Tyquan Thornton can kind of just take all the MVS jobs that MVS has had over the years, playing for like 7 teams or whatever over the last 5 seasons, it feels like at this point in time. Now, to me, what's interesting about this tier, and if I was to bet on anybody that the Falcons were going to sign, it would be these next 2 guys. It would be Brandin Cooks and Jalen Tolbert, because they have connections with the Falcons' new wide receiver coach, Robert Prince. Cooks has followed Prince to 2 different locations, starting in Houston and then Dallas. Tolbert, obviously, Prince helped develop in Dallas before leaving to go to Miami last year, where he worked with Tyreek Hill, among others. Cooks is an older player. I think he's going to be 32, something around that age. But he did finish the season strong well in Buffalo. Had a couple of solid games like week 17 and a couple of solid playoff games. So he does have a little bit left in the tank, but I think at this stage in his career, he's more of a wide receiver 3. It hasn't really been more than that over the last 3 years. If the Falcons are looking to get a functional veteran in the room, I think Cooks makes a lot of sense. I'm projecting him at 1 year, $4 million. It could be lower than that. I would be surprised if it's significantly higher than that on his next contract. And then with Jalen Tolbert, I think he'll be a little bit more expensive just because he's a young guy with upside. He was Dallas's number 2 wide receiver back in 2024 when he had his best season. They didn't have better options than him, and that's why they spent, a lot of resources to go out and get George Pickens this past offseason and upgrade that position. But he kind of fell down the totem pole, to like wide receiver 4 this past year. When I've watched Tolbert play before, there's like nothing standout trait about him. He's just kind of a solid all around sort of wide receiver. And I think that's a useful person to have, especially, where you can maybe focus a little bit more on, as we've discussed in the draft, on certain type of wide receiver that you're coveting. And you just like, we just need a guy that can do multiple things. And I think Jalen Tolbert can kind of do that and be that more all around skill set and have an opportunity to probably come in here and be more of a number 3 wide receiver. But, if need be, if you can get him performing like he did in 2024, that can be a functional number 2. That's not going to be a number 2 in a high performing passing attack, but we kind of already know that, given the current questions at quarterback and this offense, like we're not really I shouldn't say we. I am not really expecting a high performing passing attack for the Falcons in 2026. But we'll see on that front. Maybe we're singing a different tune in a week or so. But those are kind of the 2 guys that if I was a betting man, yeah, I could definitely see the Falcons bringing into the building from this mid-tier Brandin Cooks and Jalen Tolbert. And so I think those guys won't be super expensive for this team. And certainly there's a world, as we discussed the other day, where the Falcons don't cut Darnell Mooney. It sounds like they're going to cut Darnell Mooney. But in a world where they're just like, okay, well, let's get a number 3 guy in here to at least raise the floor in the event that Mooney doesn't have a bounce back year in 2026 by keeping him. And sort of we'll just sort of have to see on that front. But let's get into some of these low tier options that the Falcons will also have that are more the guys that are just kind of filling out specific roles, whether that's special teams, whether that's depth, and maybe a couple of these guys have a little bit more upside, and one of whom is a familiar face that has been in Atlanta before, and we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons.
Hey, it's Matt Derry from the Locked On Lions podcast. The people I love depend on me. If I'm gone, the financial responsibilities don't disappear. I didn't want my family figuring things out during the hardest moment of their lives. That's why I knew only one place to go. I chose life insurance through my friends at Ethos. Ethos makes getting life insurance fast and easy, 100% online. You can get a quote in seconds, apply in minutes, and get same-day coverage. There's no medical exam. You just answer a few simple health questions. You can get up to $3 million in coverage. Some policies are as low as $30 a month. I love the folks at Ethos. Protect your family with life insurance from Ethos now by going to ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. In as little as 10 minutes, you can get the free quote and up to $3 million in coverage at ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. That is ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Application times and rates may vary.
So, wrapping up today's episode, we'll break down some of these low-tier free agents. These are guys that I think are probably going to wind up settling for like 1-year deals, $3 million or less, more than likely. Again, these are guys that you're looking to kind of fill out your wide receiver room. Some of these guys can be effective number 3 wide receivers, but they tend to be a little bit more inconsistent when it comes to that, rather than being the sort of proven guys that are more those mid-tier guys. Some of these guys that we'll mention also bring some value on special teams, whether they're return specialists or coverage players, and especially in lieu of the Falcons, cutting Kadero Hodge. They'll need some, potential options there to help cover kicks and punts and whatnot, as well as not really having a solidified return specialist in the room with, them moving off of Jamal Agnew late in the season. And, Devin Tompkins not necessarily being a guy that I would just automatically toss the keys to and be like, you're our new return specialist now. So there'll be some opportunities for that. But, there will also be opportunities to get those types of players in the draft. But bringing in a free agent that can do the job just in case the draft doesn't break your way makes a ton of sense in that regard. So let's get into some of those guys. Sort of first up that we're going to talk about is, Tutu Atwell and Olamide Zaccheaus. Obviously, Zaccheaus spent this past year in Chicago. We know him from his time in Atlanta. Tutu Atwell was with the Rams this past year, where Alex Van Pelt was a senior offensive analyst, and Atwell kind of fell down the depth chart. He signed a 1-year, $10 million contract to be kind of that speed guy, re-sign with the Rams for that. And then when they kind of moved their offense to much more of a tight end heavy offense, like Atwell lost snaps to other players, right? And that's going to be the challenge for Atwell, especially playing in the Stefanski offense, which is much more similar to the 2025 Rams offense with its heavy dose of tight ends than the previous versions of the Rams offense that had featured a ton of, 3 wide receivers sets and 11 personnel and whatnot. But if you're a team that misses out on Shaheed and Naylor and Thornton, and you're like, we still want to add speed at the position, I think Tutu makes a ton of sense on a relatively cheap 1-year contract that's probably for like $3 million or something like that. I expect Olamide to get a similar price tag. We know that he does great work either for the Falcons or against the Falcons, going back to that Week 17 game last year when he was with Washington, or 2 years ago when he was with Washington. And of course, his career year in 2022 when he was basically the de facto number 2 wide receiver here in Atlanta. for a large portion of that season before the Falcons, decided in their infinite wisdom, Mac Hollins and Van Jefferson were going to solve that problem. But, Ozzy, I think, is a solid player. I've always been a fan of Ozzy. I've always had a soft spot from him for, and carried that for the last, 4+ years at this point in time. And I think would be a solid pickup for the Falcons to, again, give you a, younger player than some of these other, rather than signing Brandin Cooks. If it was up to me, I'd just sign Ozzy instead. But we'll see if the Falcons agree with me on that one. De'Ami Brown is another speedy guy. You can do some gadget stuff with him as well. So he has a useful role, but probably more of a depth piece, and did not live up to the hype that the Jaguars had initially and why they were, so desperate to go after Jacoby Myers and whatnot. Kalif Raymond's another guy, spent these last several years in Detroit, overlapping with Tanner Ingstrom there. He's still a very effective returner. He's from the Atlanta area. When Arthur Smith was here and he worked with Kalif Raymond in Tennessee prior to him going to Detroit, I was always pushing, man, we got to get Kalif Raymond. As back then we were constantly looking for speed at the position. Now he's well past his prime, Raymond, that is. But he still can add some value as a depth piece that adds some juice to your offense and helps you out on special teams. Josh Reynolds is another player from those Detroit days with Tanner Ingstrom. Ingstrom brought him to New York last year. He did not really do much there in New York. He's past his prime. He's going to be age 31, but he's a veteran guy, right? Again, if you're just looking for an adult in the room, and especially given the expectation, as we spoke to earlier, that you're going to have a lot of youth in that room, having a veteran like Josh Reynolds does make a little bit of sense. Some guys that can help out in the return game: James Prochet with the Titans, Devin Duvernay with the Bears. If you're looking for a special teams cover guy that can replace Kadero Hodge, Simi Fehoko is now with the Cardinals. He was with Robert Prince in Dallas for a couple of years. Sort of a big-bodied, poor man's Mac Hollins type of player, if that's what you want to make the comparison. Nick Westbrook-Akine, who was cut by the Dolphins alongside Tyreek Hill earlier this month. He's also a guy that can add some depth on offense and also play some special teams as well. Is worth noting that we should, talk about some other potential cap cuts that could happen over the next few days as we get geared up. Calvin Ridley, Stephon Diggs, Curtis Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Michael Pittman Jr., and of course Darnell Mooney are many of the wide receivers that people think are potentially on the roster bubble going into the league year and whatnot next week. I wouldn't expect any of those guys to be Falcons at this point in time if they do wind up getting cut. I just feel like a lot of those guys are past their, like a lot of the issues that we're talking about with some of these other guys, like Diggs brings baggage, right? Ridley is past his prime. Samuel's a older gadget guy. Brandon Ayuk, it seems like it's going to be Washington or bust for him. And then Michael Pittman is a good player, but he's basically Drake London. And maybe you can argue 2 Drake Londons are better than 1, but we have Kyle Pitts at home, right? So it's like let's get 3 Drake Londons, right? We'll just have the good Drake London, the older, lesser Drake London, Michael Pittman, and then the tight end version of Drake London in Kyle Pitts. And it's just like, we'll just have all the Drake Londons, right? And it's like, Arthur Smith would approve of that, right? Like, you remember how Arthur Smith was always just like, let me just get the same type of wide receiver over and over again, and one of them will work. We'll get 3 guys, and one of them will work. And that's how they used to roll. But, those are my thoughts on the wide receiver group. We'll see where the Falcons shop. Again, I think mid low tier is going to be where they bring it in. Like, again, if we're imagining a world where there's 5 wide receivers on this roster come week 1, Drake's going to be one of those, and then there's potentially going to be up to 4 new guys, right? And I could see a world where 2 of those guys come in free agency and 2 of those guys come in the draft, right? That's kind of where I'm sort of at this point in time. We'll see if that educated guess seems pretty educated, right? A week from today or a month from today. Or is it just like purely a guess that we got wrong? So we'll look forward to that, but we'll continue to look at several other positions here in addition to wide receiver. I think our next episode will be sort of talking about running backs, not as in-depthly, Tomorrow we'll probably get into the linebacker conversation, as well as potentially talk about, Kyler Murray, right? And so we'll see if we'll devote some time to whether or not Kyler Murray is going to do better in Kevin Stefanski / Tommy Reese's offense versus him doing nothing in Drew Petzing's offense, which is the same offense. So that will be a core part of tomorrow's episode. But make sure you check out Locked On Falcons and continue to make it your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss that upcoming content. We got to cram all this free agent stuff before we get to Monday, of course. And then twiddle our thumbs for a week. The Falcons don't make any moves. We'll see what they do. But that's in store for you on Locked On Falcons. Continue to make Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft your second listens to get the scoop on the NFL as well as the upcoming draft. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club. Use that code free agency if you want to get a month free, where you can, we'll be having plenty of conversations about the Falcons offseason moves in the days and weeks and months to come, as well as you can get an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons and other perks like, some sweet Locked On merch as well. So go check it out at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every